Munich, 2020. It is a Thursday morning in June. The stock exchange opens like every other day. Analysts drink their coffee, screens glow, numbers scroll across tickers, then a statement drops. One of the most valuable companies in Germany announces that 1.9 billion euros are missing from its accounts, not stolen, not misplaced, not lost in a transaction. The money never existed. A company worth more than Deutsche Bank, a company sitting in the most prestigious stock index in the country. A company that was protected by the German financial regulator while it lied to the entire world, and at the center of it all, a man who came from nowhere, built an empire, and then vanished overnight. This is the story of Wirecard, the largest financial fraud in the history of Germany. To understand how any of this was possible, you have to go back, not to the balance sheets, not to the regulators, you have to go back to a man who grew up in a quiet town near Vienna, Markus Braun. Braun was not a typical fraudster, he was quiet, controlled, analytical. The kind of person who measured every word before speaking. He studied business informatics in Vienna, then worked at respected consulting firms, first Diebold, then KPMG. He wore the same style of black turtleneck almost every day, he spoke softly, avoided interviews, and rarely smiled in public. He was the type of person who never raised his voice, never stood out in a room but always knew exactly where he was going, and he was patient, extremely patient. In 2002, Braun took over the leadership of a small, barely known company called Wirecard. At the time, Wirecard was nothing special. A tiny payment processor based in Aschheim, just outside Munich, handling online transactions mostly for gambling and adult websites. A company on the fringes of the industry that almost nobody took seriously, but Braun saw something that others did not. He understood that the future of money was digital, that every purchase, every transaction, every movement of capital would eventually flow through digital networks, and whoever controlled those networks would control everything. Braun began to rebuild Wirecard from the ground up. He acquired licenses, expanded into new markets, signed partnerships with banks and credit card companies. He hired engineers, invested in technology, and repositioned Wirecard not as a payment processor but as a technology company. And it worked. Year after year the numbers climbed. Within a few years Wirecard grew from a niche operation into one of the fastest growing fintech companies in Europe. Revenues climbed, stock prices soared, analysts could not stop praising it. In 2018 Wirecard achieved what many thought impossible. It replaced Commerzbank in the DAX, Germany's top 30 stock index. A company that barely anyone had heard of a decade earlier was now sitting alongside Siemens, BMW and Deutsche Bank. Wirecard became a national symbol, Germany's answer to Silicon Valley. That is what some called it. But Braun was not alone. Standing beside him was a man who was his exact opposite, Jan Marsalek. If Braun was the quiet architect, Marsalek was chaos in human form. An Austrian with no university degree, no verifiable career history, no credentials on paper but with connections that stretched from intelligence agencies to Russian oligarchs. Marsalek spoke several languages fluently, traveled the world constantly, and left behind stories that sounded too insane to be true. He boasted about personally meeting a Libyan warlord. He claimed to have access to a nerve agent from the Novichok series. He showed photos on his phone from meetings with intelligence operatives in Vienna, Moscow and Dubai. He invited business partners to dinners where former spies suddenly appeared at the table, and the most unsettling part was that much of it turned out to be real. Marsalek was not a con man in the traditional sense, he was something else entirely, a figure who existed in the space between the financial world and the shadow world. Marsalek was the one who built Wirecard's operations across Asia. He found the partner companies, closed the deals, delivered the numbers, and this is exactly where the lie began. To understand how the fraud worked, you first have to understand how Wirecard made money. The core business was simple. Wirecard processed payments. When someone paid with a credit card, Wirecard handled the transaction and kept a small percentage as a fee. Simple, scalable, profitable, but at some point that was no longer enough. The growth numbers that Braun had promised investors were too high, the real business could not support them. And that is where the so-called third-party partner business came in. In countries like the Philippines, Singapore and Dubai, Wirecard allegedly worked with local partners. These partners were supposed to process payments that Wirecard itself could not handle technically. The revenues from these operations were supposedly held in trust accounts at 2 Philippine banks. On paper everything looked perfect. The partner companies submitted reports. The trust accounts showed growing balances. The financial statements expanded year after year, but none of it was real. The partner companies barely existed or did not exist at all. The reports were fabricated, the trust accounts were empty. Wirecard invented money that was never there and booked it as real revenue, and nobody noticed, or more precisely nobody wanted to notice, because there were warnings. Many warnings, and they came early. As early as 2008, an anonymous short seller published a report claiming that Wirecard's financial statements were inflated and its business numbers manipulated. The BaFin, Germany's top financial regulatory authority, investigated the case and quickly closed it. No problem found. In 2015, an anonymous research group called Zatara published a detailed report accusing Wirecard of fraud, money laundering and falsified accounts. Wirecard's stock briefly dipped, then recovered. BaFin investigated but not Wirecard. They investigated the authors of the report. In 2016 the pattern repeated, new allegations, new reports, new signs of irregularities. Wirecard denied everything, BaFin stood behind the company, and then the Financial Times arrived. In January 2019, Dan McCrum, an investigative journalist at the Financial Times in London, published his first major article on Wirecard. McCrum had spent years analyzing Wirecard's numbers. He spoke with former employees, searched through corporate registries across Asia and traced money flows through a labyrinth of shell companies. What he found was undeniable. Wirecard's Singapore office was systematically fabricating revenues, internal documents, emails, reports showing that employees on direct orders from headquarters were creating fake bookings, invoices sent to companies with no real business activity, payments that never occurred, revenues that materialized from thin air. It was not speculation, it was not a theory, it was documented fact. And what happened? BaFin responded, but not in the way you would expect. Instead of investigating Wirecard, BaFin banned short selling on Wirecard shares. It was the first time in history that the German financial regulator had protected a single company in this way. Then they went further. They filed a criminal complaint against Dan McCrum and another Financial Times journalist. The message was unmistakable: anyone who attacks Wirecard becomes a target. Think about that for a moment. A journalist sitting in London, 1,000 kilometers away, uncovers a €1 billion fraud inside a German company. He delivers evidence, documents, emails, witness statements, and the authority whose sole purpose is to prevent exactly this kind of fraud does not side with the truth. It sides with the company, and it attacks the journalist. It tries to silence the one person who was doing what the regulator itself should have been doing for years. But BaFin was not alone in its blindness. Politicians praised Wirecard. Chancellor Angela Merkel personally lobbied for Wirecard during an official visit to China. The financial press celebrated Braun as a visionary. Analysts recommended the stock. Wirecard was not just a company, Wirecard was a national project, proof that Germany could compete in the digital age. And that project could not be allowed to fail. But McCrum did not stop. He could not. Month after month, he published new reports, new documents, new evidence. Each article was more detailed than the last. Each one brought more sources, more internal data, more proof. And the response was always the same: Wirecard denied everything. The stock wobbled briefly, and BaFin stayed silent. The cycle repeated like clockwork. Accusation, denial, silence, recovery. But the pressure was building, slowly, quietly, and then all at once. In October 2019, McCrum published his most detailed report yet. He demonstrated that Wirecard's third-party business in Asia was built on a network of shell companies, companies with no real offices, no real employees, no real business activity. This time Wirecard could not simply deny it. The supervisory board commissioned KPMG, one of the world's largest auditing firms, to conduct an independent special audit. For 4 months, KPMG examined the books. The result was devastating, but not in the way Wirecard had hoped. KPMG could not confirm the existence of the third-party business. For the claimed revenues of over €1 billion, KPMG found no sufficient evidence. The report did not say directly that Wirecard had committed fraud, but it said the numbers could not be verified, and for a publicly listed company that is nearly the same thing. Still, Wirecard held on. They called it a communication issue. The auditors simply had not received the right documents. Everything was fine, and remarkably, many people believed it. The stock fell but did not collapse. Investors stayed, analysts remained optimistic. And then came June 18, 2020. The day everything fell apart. Ernst and Young, Wirecard's long-standing auditor for over a decade, was supposed to certify the 2019 annual report. Normally a formality, a routine procedure that happened every year without anyone expecting a surprise, but this time something was missing. €1.9 billion that were allegedly held in trust accounts at 2 Philippine banks, the Bank of the Philippine Islands and BDO Unibank. Ernst and Young requested direct confirmations from the banks. For the first time in 10 years of working together, the banks responded. And their answer was unambiguous. The accounts do not exist, the money was never there, there were no trust accounts, no deposits, no balances. €1.9 billion, nearly a quarter of the entire balance sheet, a complete fabrication. Wirecard issued a mandatory disclosure. The annual report could not be certified, 1.9 billion euros were unaccounted for. The words landed on trading floors across Europe like a detonation. That day the stock dropped over 60%. Within 48 hours, Wirecard lost nearly its entire market value. Billions of euros in investor money evaporated into nothing. Years of savings, retirement funds, life plans all wiped out in a matter of hours. 2 days later, Markus Braun resigned as CEO. The next day he was arrested. The Munich public prosecutor brought charges of commercial gang fraud, embezzlement, market manipulation and accounting fraud. The estimated damage, according to prosecutors, exceeds 3.1 billion euros. Braun was released on a 5 million euro bail and has been standing trial ever since. To this day he denies any wrongdoing. He says he knew nothing, he says he was deceived himself. And Jan Marsalek, the man who controlled the Asian operations, who maintained the contacts with the shell companies, who delivered the numbers, who fabricated the reports, Marsalek vanished, literally. On June 19, 2020, one day after the news of the missing billions broke, he left his office in Munich. He drove to an airport, not Munich but Bad Verslau in Austria, a small private airstrip. From there he flew to Minsk, Belarus. It was a private jet. The passenger list showed only his name. From Minsk his trail went cold. For months no one knew where he was. Interpol placed him on the red notice list, the highest level of international manhunt. Rumors surfaced: Russia, China, the Philippines, South Africa. Then the evidence began to converge. Marsalek was in Moscow, under the direct protection of the Russian Military Intelligence Service, the GRU. According to multiple reports, he lives there under a false identity, with a new passport, a new name, a new history. A former German corporate executive, shielded by the Russian state. What exactly Marsalek offered Russian intelligence is still not fully known, but the connections that emerged during the investigation were alarming. Marsalek had reportedly maintained contact with intelligence agencies from multiple countries for years. He allegedly traded information, built networks, and cultivated political relationships that went far beyond anything a financial manager would normally do. But the story of Wirecard is not just the story of a fraud, it is the story of an entire system failing. Because this fraud could have been exposed years earlier, the signs were there, the evidence was on the table, and still nothing happened. The BaFin, Germany's highest financial authority, did not oversee Wirecard, it actively helped protect it. Instead of pursuing the allegations, it went after the critics, it filed charges against journalists, it punished short sellers, it ignored every external warning. During the parliamentary investigation that followed, the depth of the failure became clear. BaFin employees had personally traded Wirecard stock. The head of the agency, Felix Hufeld, was forced to resign. The entire structure of German financial oversight was called into question. Ernst and Young, 10 years as Wirecard's auditor, failed on every level. It turned out that Ernst and Young had never directly verified the trust accounts in the Philippines. 10 years, 10 annual reports, 10 confirmations of billions of euros, and not once had the auditing firm contacted the banks directly to ask whether the money actually existed. They accepted confirmations that Wirecard itself had arranged, documents that Wirecard provided, claiming they came from the banks, no independent verification, no direct contact with the banks, no critical questions, no on-site visits. They trusted blindly a company whose very purpose they were supposed to scrutinize. For one of the most respected auditing firms in the world, this was a failure that not only cost billions but called the entire system of financial auditing into question. On June 25, 2020, just 1 week after the collapse, Wirecard filed for insolvency. It was the first time in history that a company in the DAX, Germany's premier stock index, the showcase of the German economy, had gone bankrupt. A company that at its peak was valued at over 24 billion euros. A company worth more than Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank and Lufthansa. Institutions that had existed for over a century, and Wirecard was worth more than all of them. Until it stopped existing, everything gone, in less than a week, from 24 billion to zero. For hundreds of thousands of investors this meant total loss. Many had invested their entire savings in Wirecard stock, retirement plans, savings accounts, life earnings, all gone in a single week. Across online forums and social media, people shared their stories. A man who had sold his house and invested the entire proceeds in Wirecard. A woman who had placed her entire retirement fund in Wirecard shares because every analyst she consulted told her it was safe. A young student who had lost his complete tuition budget on a stock that was supposed to be a sure thing. These people had trusted the system. They had trusted a company protected by the financial regulator, certified by auditors, listed in the DAX, and the system had failed them completely. The trial of Markus Braun began in December 2022 at the Munich Regional Court. It is one of the largest financial trials in German post-war history. Braun denies all guilt. He claims to have known nothing about the fraud despite leading the company for over a decade. He says Marsalek organized everything alone without his knowledge, without his consent. He presents himself as a victim, a visionary betrayed by his own business partner. Whether the court believes him remains to be seen, but one question remains open regardless of the verdict. How could a company invent billions for years without anyone stopping it? The answer is uncomfortable, because everyone profited. Investors profited from rising stock prices, analysts profited from a success narrative they could sell. Politicians profited from a national champion they could stand beside, the regulator profited from not having to look too closely, and the auditors profited from a client who paid millions in fees. Everyone had a reason not to look carefully, and that is the real lesson of Wirecard. Fraud does not work in the shadows. Fraud works best when it tells exactly the story everyone wants to hear. Wirecard was never just a company, it was a narrative, the story of a German technology miracle, the story of a small payment processor from a suburb of Munich that conquered the world. Of a visionary founder who took on the giants and won. That story was so good, so convincing, so perfect that nobody wanted to question it, even when the evidence was on the table, even when journalists published the truth, even when the numbers no longer added up. Many held on to the story, because the story mattered more than the facts. That is the pattern that runs through the entire history of fraud, from Enron to Wirecard, from Theranos to FTX. It never changes. The fraudsters are never the smartest people in the room. They are not the best accountants, not the best programmers, not the best strategists. They are the ones who understand best what people want to believe, and as long as the story holds, as long as the numbers climb, as long as everyone profits, nobody looks too closely, nobody asks questions. Nobody wants to be the one who ends the fairy tale, because ending the fairy tale means losing money, and nobody wants to lose money. Jan Marsalek remains at large to this day. He is believed to be living somewhere in Russia, under a different name, in a different identity, in a different world. Protected by the same intelligence agencies he once courted over expensive dinners. The 1.9 billion euros were never found, probably because they never existed, and in Munich a trial continues that will likely take years, hundreds of hearing days, thousands of documents, dozens of witnesses. But the real story of Wirecard has already been told. It is not about a company, it is not about a balance sheet, it is not about a fraudster, it is about how an entire society chose to look away, because the truth was less attractive than the lie. Because admitting the fraud would have meant admitting that the system designed to protect people had failed at every level, that the regulators were not regulating, that the auditors were not auditing, that the politicians were not protecting, and nobody wanted to be the one to say that out loud. And perhaps that is the most dangerous realization of all, not that someone lies, but that we allow it as long as the lie sounds good enough. This channel is new, and the plan is to bring more stories like this every week, so if you enjoy this type of content, subscribe.